Inside a farmhouse in rural Buckinghamshire, 15 men sat around a table playing Monopoly. Nothing unusual, except the banknotes changing hands were real. Hundreds of thousands of pounds in stolen cash shuffled across a board game like pocket change, and it was the fingerprints they left on that board, not the robbery itself, that would bring them all down. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. This is the Unlit Room. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Tonight, one of the most audacious heists in British history, and the absurdly mundane reason it fell apart. The West Coast Main Line runs from London Euston to Glasgow Central. 399 miles of rail cutting through the English countryside and up through Scotland. In 1963, before electronic transfers, the Royal Mail used this line to move cash. Physical cash, banknotes stuffed into canvas mailbags, loaded into a high-value package carriage, HVP for short, and sent south overnight. The man responsible for driving those shipments on the night of August 8th was Jack Mills, 58 years old, a career railwayman with decades on the job. He'd made this run before. He had no reason to think this one would be different. At 3 in the morning, the Up Special, a travelling post office train carrying 70 postal workers and 128 HVP mailbags, was rolling south through Buckinghamshire. The countryside was pitch dark, no moon. At Sears Crossing, the train's headlamp caught a signal glowing red. Mills applied the brakes. A red signal meant stop. It was automatic. What Mills didn't know was that the signal had been tampered with. A man named Roger Cordray, an electrician and small-time crook from the south coast, had covered the green light with a leather glove and wired the red aspect to a 6-volt battery. A few pounds of hardware, and Britain's busiest rail line now obeyed a criminal. Mills sent his fireman, David Whitby, 26 years old, to the line-side telephone to call the signalman. Whitby climbed down, walked to the phone, and picked up the receiver. Dead line. The cables had been cut. Whitby turned back toward the locomotive. He never made it. Arms grabbed him from behind. A hand clamped over his mouth. He was dragged down the embankment and thrown to the ground. Sears Crossing sits in the kind of countryside where the loudest sound at 3 a.m. is your own breathing. Flat fields, scattered hedgerows. The nearest village, Ledburn, pronounced LED Burn, had a population you could count on 2 hands. Nobody heard a thing. Micro Cliffhanger 1. Up in the cab, Jack Mills was alone, and the men climbing toward him weren't postal workers. Mills was struck with a cosh, a weighted baton, before he could react. The blow opened a gash above his eye and left him dazed, semi-conscious, slumped against the controls. The gang now had the locomotive. They had the train. They had the 128 mailbags full of cash sitting in the HVP carriage. There was just one problem. Their own driver couldn't operate it. The gang had recruited a retired railwayman to move the train the half-mile down the track to Bridego Bridge, where a truck was waiting below the embankment. But the Class 40 diesel locomotive was different from anything the retired driver had handled. He sat in the cab, tried the controls, and couldn't get it to move. So they turned to the man they'd just beaten half unconscious. Jack Mills, bleeding from his head, was forced to his feet and made to drive his own train to the robbery site. A white sheet had been stretched between 2 poles to mark exactly where to stop. Mills brought the locomotive to a halt at Bridego Bridge, blood running down his face, with 15 criminals standing behind him. But there was one detail the planners couldn't have arranged, and didn't need to. Micro Cliffhanger 2. The HVP carriage had no alarm. It was supposed to have one. The 3 alarm-equipped carriages in the Royal Mail fleet were all out of service at the same time. Whether that was coincidence or something else, that question would take on a different weight once investigators learned who had been feeding the gang information. The robbery itself took 20 minutes. A human chain formed between the HVP carriage and an Austin Lodestar truck, parked below the bridge embankment. 120 of the 128 mailbags were passed hand-to-hand down the line. 5 postal workers, led by Frank Dewhurst, were forced face down on the carriage floor. Mills and Whitby were handcuffed together, both bleeding. By 3:45 a.m., the gang was gone. Two Land Rovers, both carrying the same plates, BMG 757A, and the Lodestar truck vanished into the Buckinghamshire countryside carrying £2,610,000. In today's money, that's roughly 60 million. The inside information had come from a figure the gang called the Ulsterman. Investigators later determined this was a senior Royal Mail security officer who knew the shipment schedules, the carriage layouts, the alarm status, everything. He was never publicly identified, never charged. The system hadn't just been robbed, it had been betrayed from inside. The plan on paper was nearly perfect. The signal trick, the inside man, the bridge as a loading dock, even the matching license plates on the getaway vehicles. A small touch, but it meant any witness who saw one Land Rover would corroborate the other. 15 men had rehearsed this for months. The hard part was over, or so they thought. The gang retreated to Leatherslade Farm, pronounced Letherslade, an isolated property in Oakley, Buckinghamshire, purchased weeks earlier as their hideout. The plan was to stay for 24 hours, divide the money, and leave. An associate had been hired to come in after they left and scrub the farm clean, burn the mailbags, wipe every surface. The associate never showed. One day became two became 5. The gang couldn't leave a farmhouse full of evidence, but they also couldn't stay forever. So they waited, and while they waited, they played Monopoly. Real Monopoly. On a real board, except they'd gotten bored of the paper money that came in the box, so they used the stolen banknotes instead. Thousands of pounds pushed across the board for landing on Park Lane or Passing Go. Fingerprints pressed into every bill, every card, every surface of the board. On August 13th, 5 days after the robbery, police found Leatherslade Farm. The associate had finally tried to arrange the cleanup, but by then investigators were already closing in. Inside they found mailbags, wrappers, vehicles that were supposed to have been destroyed, and the Monopoly board. The fingerprints on that board matched the prints on file for nearly every member of the gang. By April 1964, most of the gang had been tried and convicted at Aylesbury. The ringleaders, Bruce Reynolds, Gordon Goody, and others, received 30-year sentences, among the longest ever handed down for robbery in Britain. Ronnie Biggs, whose role was minor, later escaped prison, fled to Brazil, and became the most famous face of the robbery. A strange irony, given that he was one of its least important members. The stolen money was largely never recovered. Of the £2,610,000 taken that night, only a fraction was found. The rest simply disappeared into a network that investigators were never able to fully trace. But the cost that doesn't appear in any ledger is the one that matters most. Jack Mills, the driver who was beaten, who bled, who was forced to drive his own train to the site of the robbery, returned to work on light duties. He tried, but the headaches never stopped. The anxiety never faded. He retired in 1967 and died in 1970 at 65. The official cause was leukemia, but people who knew him said the robbery broke something in Jack Mills that medicine couldn't reach. He's the part of this story that the heist mythology always leaves out. 15 men got rich for a few months. One man lost the rest of his life. The Great Train Robbery became legend almost immediately, a caper story, a folk tale about clever criminals who outsmarted the system. And in a way, they did. The signal trick worked. The inside man delivered. The bridge was the perfect loading dock, but they planned every second of the crime and not a single second of the aftermath. A no-show cleaner, a board game. Fingerprints on stolen banknotes used for pretend rent. £2,610,000 undone by Monopoly. There's something in that, about the distance between the plan and the cleanup, the audacity and the carelessness, the brilliance of the crime and the stupidity of what came after. Maybe the lesson is that getting away with it was always the harder part. Maybe the lesson is simpler than that. Maybe it's just that 15 men who thought of everything forgot the most obvious thing. You have to leave. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend. But maybe don't tell them it's all real until after they've finished. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the unlit room. See you in the dark.